Let me take you back to about 7 years ago. It was supposed to be a casual morning flight, a short sightseeing trip.
Nothing too crazy. I was in the cockpit of a Cessna 172.
Flying with my brother and 2 cousins, I had this gut feeling that I needed to get this flight in quickly because I knew some bad weather was coming in. It was a beautiful morning at first.
But about 20 minutes in, things started to change. The clouds were building, and I could see a little lightning off in the distance.
The first thing that crossed my mind was that it was time to turn around and head back. I radioed in my intentions to the uncontrolled airport. We had an FBO, and someone came back over the radio with the wind report. But something about it didn't sound right to me. The numbers didn't compute, and I should have asked for clarification right then and there. But I didn't. Looking back, that was the first mistake. As we made our way back, I started noticing just how bad the wind had gotten. The gusts were pushing us all over the place. I was on final approach, and keeping the plane aligned with the runway was starting to feel impossible. My hands were starting to sweat, and I knew I wasn't going to make it on my first attempt. I called for a go-around. But by this point, my stomach was in knots. I was trying to keep my cool, especially since my cousins were in the back seat, completely oblivious to the growing tension. My brother could tell something was wrong, though, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. On the second attempt, I was giving it everything I had. I was fighting the controls. But finally, I got the rudder peg all the way to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground. The landing was rough, but it was on the runway, and we were safe. I taxied to the parking area and shut down the engine the second I jumped out of that plane. My hands were shaking, and I let out a huge sigh of relief. My cousins, they had no idea what had just happened. To them, it was just an exciting flight. My brother, though, knew exactly what was going on, and I filled him in on the details once we were on the ground. Apparently, there were a bunch of guys from the FBO watching me land. I can only imagine what they were saying to each other, probably telling me to go somewhere else. In hindsight, I'm honestly surprised I managed to land that plane safely, especially since it was basically my first crosswind landing. It was like I was the star of their worst landing viewing party. Let's jump to another memory, this time from my student pilot days. I was in the process of getting my private pilot's license, PPL, and one day I was flying solo in a Cessna 152. The wind was pushing 15 knots with gusts up to 20, and there was turbulence all around. I honestly don't know what anyone at the flight school was thinking, letting a 16-year-old kid take off in those conditions, but I did. Everything was going fine for the first few circuits. I was practicing landings in turbulent conditions, and although the bumps were uncomfortable, I was handling it. On my last circuit of the day, things started to go sideways. I was on final approach, full flaps, and my speed was way too slow for the conditions. If you don't know when it's turbulent, you need to come in faster than usual. But I didn't think about that, and I was flying as slow as the aircraft could handle. I was maybe 300 feet above the ground when the wind completely disappeared. I lost 15 to 20 knots of headwind almost instantly. At that point, I was falling fast, and I had no airspeed to recover. The stall warner started screaming at me, and the controls became useless, like a limp joystick. I was completely out of control, but somehow I instinctively pushed the throttle full forward and slightly lowered the nose. All this happened in about 5 seconds, and it felt like I was in autopilot mode. You know how when you drive somewhere, and then you realize you don't even remember the drive. That's what this was like. Scary stuff. Somehow, I managed to recover and land safely. I went home afterward and took a nap honestly. I think my brain needed it. When I walked in the door, my parents said I looked like a ghost. I guess it was that close to being a real disaster, and I hadn't even realized it until later. These experiences have been etched in my memory for years. There's something about flying, something about being that far up, with so many variables, that makes you appreciate every moment of calm. Sometimes you can feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, and all you can do is keep going, hoping that everything will be okay. What I didn't realize at the time was that some of these moments would stay with me for a long time. The pressure, the sweat, and the raw instinct that takes over when things go wrong. It's something I'll never forget. Story 3 takes us to a time when things happened so quickly. The entire ordeal lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet, it could have ended in disaster in a blink of an eye. I was flying a CH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq, mid-July 2008, when the temperature was hovering above 130 RF. The helicopter was packed full, carrying 36 passengers, and I was flying low about 100 feet above the ground while maintaining a speed of 100 to 140 knots. Definitely not the kind of flying you would do in the US, where you would typically be flying at a higher altitude and a slower speed. We hit a thermal pocket, and suddenly the helicopter shot up. I had to push the cyclic forward, something that felt a bit too much like a joystick between my legs to maintain altitude. The other pilot I was flying with, a combat vet, wanted me to keep the aircraft no higher than 120 feet and no lower than 80 feet. It was a tricky balance, but that was my job, keeping the aircraft stable. Out of nowhere, we hit a strong downdraft, and the aircraft just started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could, but the control was limited by my body armor, which blocked me from pushing it any further. I saw the altimeter drop all the way down to 19 feet, and I thought, this is it. Somehow, though, by the last possible second, we stopped falling and started climbing again. During the debrief, the other pilot, one of my closest friends, now told me that he'd never been so close to death before. I wasn't shaken until I heard him say that. Thinking back on it now, I still get chills typing this out. It's one of those moments you never forget. But, thankfully, we walked away without a scratch. Now, let me tell you about a wild moment I had when I was just starting out as a student pilot. I was only 14 years old at the time, and I had about 15 hours of flight time under my belt. I was getting close to soloing, but I still needed some more practice, especially when it came to landings. One day, I was flying with my instructor, practicing the basics and preparing for some touch and go landings. As we came back toward the airport, we needed to pass through Detroit Metropolitan Airport's Bravo airspace. It's a busy, controlled airspace, so I knew we needed permission to fly through it. But just before I called for clearance, I noticed that my instructor had gone completely silent. I looked over at him, and he looked terrible, like he was about to pass out. That's when I realized something was really wrong. He wasn't breathing. My heart started racing, and I immediately took control of the situation. I called up Detroit Approach and declared medical emergency, explaining that my instructor was unconscious and not breathing. I also told them I had never landed by myself before, especially not in such a large, busy airport. The controllers at DTW were amazing. They were calm, collected, and directed me to either land at DTW or Willow Run Airport. Willow was farther out, so I opted for DTW, knowing I'd have to cross some busy airspace. But DTW's approach team was excellent, and they guided me through it, even managing to clear other aircraft out of the way. As I lined up for final approach, I focused
all my attention on making the smoothest landing I possibly could. When I touched down, it was butter smooth. The best landing I've ever made. The fire trucks were there waiting
For me on the taxiway, ready to rush in case anything went wrong. My instructor, who had suffered a heart attack at only 25 years old, ended up being okay. He survived. And thanks to the swift response of the flight controllers, the emergency response time was just under 10 minutes. Story 4
takes us to another hair-raising moment when I was still a student pilot.
Though a bit older than 14, I was flying solo, practicing patterns, and preparing to get my solo endorsement.
I had been flying for a few months and was pretty confident in my abilities by then. However,
things took a sudden turn on one of my final circuits. The weather in Florida is notoriously unpredictable in the afternoon, and this day was no different. As I made my approach, I felt a sudden, unexpected drop in altitude. The plane plummeted downward, and it felt like something had just yanked us out of the air. I was only about 100 feet above the runway at the time, so I had no time to think. But instinct kicked in, and I pushed the throttle all the way forward, adding power and gently pulling back on the stick to recover. I had no time to process what had happened. It felt like everything happened so fast, but somehow I managed to pull off a go-around, smoothly transitioning back into a stable climb. It wasn't the scariest moment of my flying career, but I did feel a rush of relief when I knew I had handled it well. The instructor I was flying with wasn't the one I was used to, but as soon as I executed the go-around, he smiled and complimented me on my quick decision-making. It was a small victory for me as a new student. The whole experience reminded me that you don't always have time to think, but you can train your instincts to do what's right in the moment. As a student pilot, you're constantly testing yourself, always trying to push a little further, hoping you'll be able to handle whatever comes your way. And let me tell you, there are times when it feels like the universe is testing you just to see if you're ready. The weight of being responsible for the lives of those in the plane with you can be overwhelming. But when you survive those moments, and you don't even realize just how close things came to going sideways, it's the ultimate reminder of why we practice, why we train, and why we keep learning. Let's fast forward to a time when I was flying in a military helicopter. I was piloting a CH-47D Chinook in Iraq, and it was July 2008. The temperature was well over 130 F, and the helicopter was packed with 36 passengers. I was flying low, about 100 feet above the ground, and at a speed of around 100 to 140 knots, definitely not the kind of flying you would do in a civilian setting. I had a thermal pocket push us up, which is when warm air rises quickly and can mess with the stability of the helicopter. Normally, you'd use the cyclic push forward to maintain altitude, but in this case, it felt like my joystick control was almost useless. Between my legs, I had a senior combat pilot next to me, who had over 1.00 combat hours, and he was dead set on me, keeping the aircraft at exactly 100 feet, not more, not less. This was a tricky mission, but I thought I had it under control. Out of nowhere, though, we hit a downdraft, and the Chinook started falling fast. I yanked back on the cyclic with all my strength, but because of my body armor, I couldn't get it to respond fully. I watched the altimeter drop to 19 feet, and I could feel my heart racing. I was sure that we were going to crash, but miraculously, the aircraft started climbing again, just before we hit the ground. After the flight, my co-pilot, now one of my closest friends, told me that he'd never been so close to death in his entire life. Hearing that hit me harder than I thought it would. It was a wake-up call that things can go wrong fast, and when they do, your training, instincts, and the people you fly with make all the difference. One of the scariest moments I've ever had was when I was a 14-year-old student pilot, just starting to solo. I had about 15 hours of flight time, and I was getting close to the point where I would fly on my own. I remember my instructor and I were doing some basic flying before we headed back to the airport. On the way back, we had to pass through Detroit Metropolitan's Bravo airspace, which meant I needed clearance to fly through it. But something wasn't right that day. As I was about to make the radio call for permission, I looked over at my instructor and realized that he looked terrible. He wasn't breathing, and he looked like he might pass out. My heart raced, but I quickly took control of the situation. I called Detroit Approach and declared a medical emergency, telling them my instructor wasn't breathing, and I was a student with no experience landing on my own, especially at such a large airport. The flight controllers at DTW were absolutely amazing. They immediately helped me by giving me vectors to land safely. I had a few options, and even though Willow Run Airport was farther away, I chose to land at DTW because it was closer and didn't add any more complications to the already stressful situation. They gave me clear instructions, making sure I was safe while guiding me around larger commercial aircraft. When I came in for the approach, I was focused on making the smoothest landing I could, even though I was completely on my own in the cockpit. The landing turned out to be the smoothest I've ever made. I could feel the fire trucks waiting for me on the taxiway, ready to jump into action. But luckily, nothing happened. It turned out that my instructor, only 25 years old at the time, had suffered a heart attack. Thanks to the quick response from Detroit ATC and emergency services, he survived. The whole ordeal taught me just how critical the role of air traffic control is in emergency situations. Let's take a breather before I dive into another story. It's funny because while I've experienced moments that felt terrifying, I've also learned how to manage my fears, especially in those tense, split-second moments. You're constantly reminded that aviation, for all its safety measures and controls, has moments where you have to trust your gut, but it's also a team effort. Your training, the co-pilot, and in some cases, the air traffic controllers are what make sure everyone makes it home safe. I remember another situation when I was working as a flight instructor, teaching a student how to fly. We were flying on a clear day, and things were going pretty smoothly. But out of nowhere, my student noticed something in the cockpit, a spider. I didn't mind it, so I went ahead and killed it, hoping it wouldn't distract my student. Well, my student saw me do it, and that's when I realized, turns out, my student was terrified of spiders. So, throughout the rest of the flight, I made sure to kill any spiders I saw, keeping it all under wraps, hoping they wouldn't notice. Every time I reached for the back seat, I made sure to squish any little spider that might crawl out of its nest. The whole time I couldn't help but laugh to myself. It was funny to think about how one little bug could cause so much anxiety. But at the same time, it was a reminder of how much the little things, those tiny distractions, can make a flight feel a lot more complicated. And then there was that one time when I was a passenger rather than a pilot. My buddy, who had his private license, had been flying me around on a few short trips, just for fun. One day, we were flying over Crater Lake in Oregon. The weather was perfect for a flight, and the views were incredible. We were cruising at around 8.0 feet, with Crater Lake sitting at 6.0 feet. But then, my buddy dropped this bombshell. He told me that if the engine failed at that moment, we wouldn't be able to glide to safety. He said that the single-engine Cessna we were flying could only glide about 2 to 3 miles in an emergency. But Crater Lake's diameter was about 8 miles. We'd be stuck with no good place to land.
I remember asking him what we'd do in that situation. He casually said, "I'd just nosedive into the water."
You'd probably drown, or at least pass away quickly.
I don't know why, but hearing that just completely freaked me out. To make things worse, we didn't have his instrument rating yet,
so we couldn't break through the clouds. That day, I realized how quickly things could go wrong if the weather conditions were worse or if something happened to the plane. This next story takes us back to a flight that, in hindsight, could have ended very differently. But thankfully it didn't. I wasn't the pilot for this one, but I did experience the whole thing from the passenger seat.
It happened on a flight from Chicago to Washington National back in 1974. The weather was already bad.
But that's not what made this story stick with me. We were actually rerouted to Dulles because National was closed due to the weather. So, as we were circling above Washington, the flight got delayed and the situation got worse. The turbulence was rocking us from side to side, and you could feel the descent becoming sharper and sharper. I looked around, and I could see the flight attendants trying to do their best to keep everything calm. But you could tell something wasn't quite right. The plane had hit a massive downburst. And suddenly, we were falling. There were screams in the cabin, people clutching, armrests as if their lives depended on it. And then the plane jolted down about 1.00 feet in what felt like an instant. The flight attendants were thrown up against the ceiling, but miraculously, none of them were injured. Still, the descent felt like we were out of control. And I remember thinking it was over. As we slammed back into our seats, everything seemed to settle, and the pilot was on the intercom, reassuring us, though there was an edge to his voice.
The passengers didn't know exactly how close we had come to disaster, but I certainly did.
We landed safely, and I remember the applause as we deplaned. We weren't aware of the extent of what had happened at the time, but it made me realize just how unpredictable flying can be, even for experienced pilots. Story 12 takes us to one of my first solo flights. I was excited, probably too excited, to be honest. It was the culmination of months of training, and I wanted to make sure everything went perfectly. I'd been practicing my taxiing and landings.
And this was supposed to be a big moment. The weather was clear, and everything seemed fine until I started my taxi down the runway.
I had my phone with me, and I decided to record this special moment for posterity. Well, I didn't account for the fact that old propeller planes don't always taxi straight,
and I was too distracted trying to get the right angle on my phone. Before I knew it, the plane rolled off the runway and into a grassy ditch. My heart dropped. I was just sitting there, thinking, how the heck do I get this plane out of here now? Over the radio, there was a few seconds of silence. I could only imagine that the controllers were processing what had happened. Eventually,
they came on, and without skipping a beat, asked if I was okay, trying to save myself from total embarrassment. I powered up the engine and tried to get back onto the runway. To my surprise, it worked, and I made it back on the asphalt. The rest of the flight went as planned, and I even managed to land back safely. But when I returned to the hangar, I could see that my instructor knew what had happened. There was no way he didn't see it, and I could tell by the look on his face that he was just waiting for me to explain myself. As for the video, yep, it still exists somewhere. It's the airplane version of Don't Text and Drive. Then there's the story of what I witnessed as a passenger. I've flown a lot over the years, but there are still a few experiences that stick with me. This one
in particular, happened while flying into San Francisco SFO. We were landing late at night after a long flight from Honolulu.
And the approach was a bit rough. The next thing I knew, the plane was coming down, and we hit something. It felt like we dropped several hundred feet, and the engines roared back to life. The captain came over the intercom and, in a calm but slightly frantic voice, explained that there had been cross-traffic on the runway, and we were going to try the landing again. No one really knew what had just happened, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. I looked around at the other passengers, and the two women in front of me were talking in thick Southern accents, oblivious to what had just happened. Honestly, we could have easily ended up in another runway, but somehow we were spared. When we finally landed, I remember hearing the captain say, "Well, folks, welcome to Dallas-Fort Worth," like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Now, here's a story from my days as a commercial helicopter pilot. It was a fairly routine flight, and I was flying an R-44 over some vineyards with 3 passengers on board. We were nearing the end of the tour when the clutch light came on. Now, in a Robinson helicopter, it's pretty common for the clutch light to come on, especially in cooler weather. It's usually no big deal. It just means the clutch is adjusting. But when the clutch light stays on for too long, that's when you start to worry. At first, I thought it was nothing. But then,
I started counting the seconds, and by the time I hit 10 seconds, I knew something was wrong. I could feel the tail of the helicopter starting to shake without thinking too much about it. I pulled the circuit breaker for the clutch and pushed for more airspeed. I needed to get extra altitude and prepare for an emergency landing. Thankfully, we made it to the ground without any issues. But when I checked the clutch, only one of the 4 dot belts was still in place. The passengers, completely unaware, got out thinking the flight had been smooth and uneventful. I let them walk away,
none the wiser to how close we came to a serious emergency. Finally, let's wrap up with a moment that might not
seem all that serious on the surface. But, for me,
it was a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, even in what seems like a normal situation. I was on a commercial flight from Miami to Boston, flying on American Airlines. Halfway into the flight,
something went wrong with the cabin pressure. The air conditioning was out, and it was getting uncomfortably hot. As we flew along, the pilot came on the intercom and let us know that we were going to have to return to Miami because we had lost cabin pressure. The next few minutes were tense. The crew was buckling up,
and I could feel the unease in the cabin. We didn't know what was going to happen next.
When we finally landed, it was clear that the situation was serious. We were instructed to remain seated, and emergency crews were lining the tarmac, ready for any possible outcome. I've been on hundreds of flights, but there's something about that feeling of uncertainty, knowing that a plane can be in trouble and there's nothing you can do about it, that sticks with you. All these stories, these experiences, have one thing in common. They remind me how unpredictable flying can be. Every flight is a reminder of how important safety is, how critical it is to stay calm in the face of danger,
and how your training and instincts will always guide you through the worst of it. And for passengers, it's often easy to forget how much goes into making each flight as safe as possible,
even in the face of uncertainty. Flying is about decisions split second, decisions that can make all the difference between a safe landing and a potential disaster. Whether you're a seasoned pilot or a student in the cockpit, it's those moments that shape who you are and how you approach every flight.